so we watched the entire trial just to emotionally process, including the jury selection, just to emotionally process our own feelings, which were incredibly complicated because like there were people even in our own families who lived, just outside the city in the greater metro area, but in the suburbs. And even that cultural divide was so pronounced that, they had a detachment about it that we couldn't have, because we saw this person. We saw George Floyd. We were like 5 feet away from him. And so we could not fail to see him as a human being. Of course, we didn't know him, but he was instantiated and real for us in a way that we didn't have the luxury of converting it into some sort of ideological frame.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. If you don't know where that is, you should really look it up on a map. It's not between Atlanta and Athens, although it's closer to Athens in Greece. So, I'm doing this dialogue. You're probably going to see it when I'm actually in Prague, if you're getting in on it early. If it's later, I have no idea where I'm going to be. But I would like to introduce you to a guy named C.W. Weeks. He got in touch with me through Twitter, and I thought, hey, this guy sounds interesting. He might make a good conversant, a good dialogist. And so we had a very interesting conversation, and it went on for a while. But I present it to you. Enjoy. Or as the French say, profitez. Get something out of it. Greetings.
Byrne Power.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You're not recording this, are you? Because it kind of said you were.
Well, I said I wouldn't, but I'm not going to use it necessarily. But in case it gets really interesting, I'm going to do the Paul Vanderklay method.
Well, I guess I'll give myself over to fate and hope that it works out.
I have no plans whatsoever right now, but I figured a lot of this will just be personal. And if we were to go off into some subject, maybe that could be interesting. So, but if it's mostly personal, I'll probably not do it. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah. I think there might be something. There might be something that I would want edited out.
Absolutely.
Okay with that.
I never put anything up there just wet from recording. I always do a little editing here and there. So if you say something that's just like, oh, don't say that, don't worry, I won't. So.
Well, I appreciate that.
So
yeah, I'm so not used to having attention. I have to tell you, it's really strange. Like I've been feeling like, I don't know how acquainted you are with Schaeffer's literature. I know you're like a big known quantity.
I've only read everything.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, his idea of being extruded into a position of influence, like I felt very much like that, especially recently.
Right.
Which, I'm grateful for in the sense that, I went to Bible college.
Where?
At Moody Bible Institute.
Okay.
To pursue pastoral ministry, but specifically a pulpit ministry in an urban context.
Mm-hmm.
It was like this very highly developed aesthetic vision.
Right.
Of like a very highbrow, intellectually qualified, like urban ministry.
Right. So did you graduate
But
from there?
no, I ended up leaving actually after having an epiphany that God exists in a Starbucks under the L train.
Okay, okay. Are you
And
still in the Chicago area?
no, I live in Minneapolis,
Okay.
just 5 short blocks from George Floyd Square, in fact.
Right, that's right. You were telling me about that. And that must have been quite an event for you two. I mean, that whole period, but starting with the George Floyd event, how much of that did you actually see? I mean, I imagine
Well, that
the
was the
police
crazy.
were
Yeah,
moving
well,
people around.
that was the crazy thing because yeah, my wife and I were, as literally walking by as
Right,
he was being arrested. We had it was I believe it was Memorial Day, so it's hot summer day. There's like a Dairy Queen down the street here
right.
past that intersection. We just sort of naively walked over there, got some ice cream, and we're walking back. And the funny thing was, I knew this British guy who sent me a screenshot, after everything went down,
Right.
sent me a screenshot of us from apparently the surveillance footage from a little Chinese restaurant at that intersection that had been published by the Washington Post.
Mm, mm,
And he was like, "Is this you?"
right.
And I was like, "Oh, that's great," but it was us at the very end of the. I don't know if that video is still out there or not, but it was like in the early days when they were trying to get as much information as possible. So it was like in the initial reporting and fact finding on the event, and it had already become like a national thing at that point. And so, but in the end of this Washington Post video, it's kind of funny because there's really no reason that we had to be in the video because George Floyd had already been led across the street and was kind of out of sight at that point. But they just kind of let it run like the few extra seconds to have my wife and I walk by obliviously eating ice cream, which I almost wondered if it was like an irresistible symbol of white privilege or something.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that is I assume you have a copy of that video now. That's something to save for the future because you can say, I was there. And I find many of the most interesting moments in my life, you get to a point in the future where you look back and go, that says that I was in this place. And there's something about that I find it meaningful and humbling to say that you're amongst in a certain area when something interesting or important or meaningful happened to you or around you or something like that.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm not likely to forget. I don't actually have a copy of the video, and frankly, I don't really have any interest of leveraging my.
No, it's not about that.
I know. I totally understand what you mean, but yeah, like memorializing it. And actually, well, here's an example of something that I did do, which is exactly in keeping with the spirit of what you just described. Like and it was weird because it's totally uncharacteristic. And I've never done anything like this before. But my wife and I, in order to process, the complete mindfuck that was being so close to this thing that was simultaneously like a local issue for our neighborhood and like a global issue for ideological considerations, that became ultimately ubiquitous, and being like so close to it and yet not really involved at all.
Right. Well, what kind of a neighborhood is that?
The Bryan neighborhood where we live, actually, it's interesting. That intersection is, I'll go into that in a second, but what I did was we watched the entire trial just to emotionally process, including the jury selection, just to emotionally process our own feelings, which were incredibly complicated because like there were people even in our own families who lived, just outside the city in the greater metro area, but in the suburbs. And even that cultural divide was so pronounced that, they had a detachment about it that we couldn't have because we saw this person. We saw George Floyd. We were like 5 feet away from him. And so we could not fail to see him as a human being. Of course, we didn't know him, but he was instantiated and real for us in a way that we didn't have the luxury of converting it into some sort of ideological frame.
Right.
And of course, I don't begrudge people for doing that. And I understand that there's a sense in which it's even necessary. We have to have a common vocabulary to discuss really complex issues on a popular level. So I don't begrudge anybody for that at all. But we were so alienated as that was happening, even among close members of our family. And so after having watched the entire trial, when the verdict was coming in, I actually recorded that. Right. I recorded my wife and my reaction. And I'd never done anything like that before. And to your point, I think it's important, and I'm glad that I did that.
Yeah, well, as in all things in reality, everything is always more complex. And what the media tends to do is to give us the symbol. And that was a very powerful symbol that they gave, powerful enough that with the help of activism and genuine feelings of rage and grief, this exploded, and then went on and on into all sorts of other forms throughout the months in different places.
Yeah.
So it was a very highly.
Were you there in Georgia as that?
Oh
was
yeah,
happening?
I've been here for 3 years. So.
Well, may I ask you what it was like for you, or what it was like around you when it first hit, and how you came to realize that it was like, because it's so weird, because we're so in the bubble.
Right.
Like I know people who work at the White House talk about like the White House bubble. They're like at the center of everything, and yet they have like no clue what the fuck is happening. They're like how people are perceiving it. That's kind of how it was for us. So I'm really curious what your experience of it was.
Radically different, because the issues which motivate that kind of reaction don't really play here. And the reason they don't play here is because we're on the other side of that border that used to be the Soviet sphere and indeed the Soviet Union. So there were a few people who were, upset. People were saying, "Oh, that looks terrible. That's not good." And at the same time, I think most people, they didn't feel particularly connected to it. Now, I did run into some college students. There's one university here, ironically called the Free University, which charges the most money and has the most Western.
They have one of those. They have one of those in Amsterdam too.
Well, it has also the most Western program. And so I met this one college student from there, and she was working at a store, and it was her and someone else. Both asked me, "Is just like, is there racism everywhere in America?" And I was just like, not what you're thinking. It's not like you're walking down the street and there are people being pulled over, and it's not like. It's just like, remember, we have the richest Black American, people of African ancestry, apart from some dictator somewhere. America has the richest people who are Black in the world. It's not like people are prevented from doing things. Yes, there are problems because of poverty, because of drugs, and there is a residual of the racism, and it affects some people more than others. But the implication that some people derived from it was that suddenly they started seeing America as this, like, I don't know, worse than South Africa in the middle of the apartheid. And then other people were kind of like, I remember this one very interesting conversation about a month later. And there's a mountain right behind where I live. There's the same mountains behind me now, but I'm living in a different part of town. And I went for a hike up this mountain. And as I was hiking back down, I met this older Georgian man who had translated some books into English, and he, obviously a very well-educated man. We started talking about. He said, "I want to know what's going on." So I gave him, the best perspective that I had on it, which is to say, very complicated. And then a woman stopped along the way, overheard us. She was Georgian, and she was like, "I really like Donald Trump." And actually, you find a lot of that here. Because for instance, right now, I am sure Georgians are looking at Biden's remarks about Ukraine with horror, because they just say, well, usually it starts in Ukraine and then comes back here, or it starts here and goes to Ukraine. And Russia is, I would say, probably about 85% hated here. There are probably some people who still wish they were part of something like the Soviet Union, but most people, if you want to I've seen the Georgians get up on their hind legs, and it's always about Russia. That's the main thing that will bring them all
together. So Byrne, if that is a function of foreign policy, and I am so stuck on epistemological questions in Christian religious philosophy, that I am it's kind of reminds me of how C.S. Lewis allegedly just never read the newspaper.
Sure.
I'm not claiming to be a C.S. Lewis.
Oh, no.
But
I understand.
But I'm somewhat ignorant of the geopolitical goings on. But I'm curious, maybe my timeline is off, but was Trump in office when Russia moved into the Crimea?
No, that was Obama.
Okay. Yeah, because I was going to say that would seem.
No, that was around 2014 or so. So, yeah. And of course, then the media went on this whole, and I quote, Trump, Russia, possible collusion, just over and over and over, never ever proving it at all.
So how do you think that woman reconciled or did she not buy the narrative of Trump being in bed with Russia? If what you're saying is true, that there's.
Oh, no one here believed that.
Okay.
That was just simply, they all most of the Georgians recognize that as Americans have no clue what's going on with Russia. And, so
they actually saw Trump as an.
And they wanted Trump to win again, the majority of people here, I think, because of that fact. They figured that Biden would do exactly the kind of dumb things he's doing right now. Whereas, because the Georgians understand something about the Russians. And also, since I'm here, I was just thinking about this the other day. Where else in the world could I live where I hear Russian on the streets? I hear Iranian on the streets. It's not that far from me. I hear English on the streets. I hear Turkish. I hear Arabic. I hear Greek. I hear, German. I hear sometimes French, sometimes Japanese, more so. Indian, one or two of the Indian dialects, because there's quite a few medical students from India here. Where else? And so, for me, the Russia thing is not abstract at all here. Because
how many languages do you personally have, Byrne?
I only speak, I don't know, about 1 and maybe 2/3. I speak English, obviously, and I'm, if you throw me into France, I'm going to operate pretty well. And Georgian, I'm slowly learning. I would never say I know it. It's one of the most complicated languages. I'm reminded of what the missionaries from Campus Crusade said about the Hungarian language. They called it the heavenly language because it takes an eternity to learn it. And Georgian is similar, because not only is it unconnected to any other language apart from a couple local dialects that never escaped the country, it is also got a completely different alphabet.
Wow.
So it doesn't.
It's not like English and Dutch are in the Germanic family.
It doesn't have a Latin script. Doesn't have a Cyrillic script. It's got something that looks quite psychedelic. you know, so I feel like
kind of like Klingon or something.
yeah, it's just bizarre. It's just I think Klingon probably makes more sense if you're coming from English than George Cartuli is what they don't call it Georgian.
Probably so, especially since it was conceived in idyllic, vacuum-like circumstances.
Well, yeah, the Georgians tell a story about Georgia is a fascinating country with a really long history. Some people say it's just like, I've had people say, well, is Georgia like Russia? And I'm like, no, don't ever compare Georgia to Russians. That's like number one thing, never do, because they are very different. But not only that, the Russian culture is like a baby compared to Georgian culture. Georgian culture, they started fermenting wine here. It's I think it is the earliest place. There's different studies, but it's the earliest place we know of where wine was fermented, about 6,000 BC.
Wow.
So they've been doing that, but it's a country about the size of Austria. It's got mountains taller than the Alps, and they grow oranges here.
Wow. So is that part of your but was part of your aesthetic attraction to L'Abri? Or at least that wasn't a motive, maybe, but is that kind of partially satisfied by the mountains there?
Oh yeah, I love mountains. And in Alaska, I was surrounded by mountains as well. No, and one of the best things, I don't know, did you see the video I made a couple of weeks ago called The Importance of L'Abri in the 21st Century?
I did, yes. I thought that was really fascinating.
And for me, just the bus ride up to L'Abri, it's about 3,000 feet up. Just the mountains that are next to it and the valley you're in. I mean, it's gotten, since I originally went there in 1978, late 78, there's been more development in the ski resort up above them, another 1,000 feet, Villar it's called. And
another 1,000 feet. That's just like so mind-boggling for
someone in the Midwest. Yeah, exactly.
It's another 1,000 feet up.
Although that's like my hike behind my house to go up 1,000 feet. I cheat sometimes, take the bus up to the top and walk down. But that's like basically like even here, there's a park behind me that's a block away. That park leads into the mountains. I could go from there and walk to Armenia. So. And it just goes up and up and up. And there's two major mountain ranges here. There's the Greater Caucasus, which are just mind-bogglingly tall and steep. And I made some videos about up in these valleys up there. I mean, you've climbed up to about 7,000 feet. And yet you're in a valley that just seems full of pasture land and there's cows grazing. And the serious mountains go up to like 15,000 feet. But then this side is called the Lesser Caucasus. And the weird thing about them is most of them were formed by volcanoes. That was more geological uplift. Oh, wow. But these are like volcanoes. So everything is these humps. And so where I am now, the ground level is about 1,500 feet. And it goes up and up. And you think if you go up to the top of this mountain behind me, which is about 2,500 feet, that you'll be at the top of the mountain. But then you get there and you say, oh, there's another hump, and then another hump, and another hump. And eventually I've been up on a pass up quite, about 4-hour drive away. That's 7,500 feet. And you look off and there's a huge hump and it's like 11,000 feet. But it's all these humps that look like hills rather than what you find on the other side, which is it's like suddenly it's like the valley's end and it's just like straight up, but it's still all grass until you get to the point where it breaks out on top. So neither range reminds me of anything hardly outside of this. But that was a draw, although not the main draw. The main draw was there were three factors, probably maybe four. The music was probably the first one. The music and the folk dancing was the second one, because they have like these outrageously beautiful but also complex folk dances that involve things like men dancing on their toes.
Wow.
You know, and jumping and doing things and fighting with swords and all this other stuff. And then there's the fact that it's a Christian country, and it's after Armenia, it's the second Christian country. So it goes back to, I think, the 4th century. And then there are many other factors. Mountains are just like, oh, that's nice. You know, that's a nice extra. But I also love the culture. Puppets was very important because I study puppetry, and on both a level of how do you do these things, because I might want to do this myself, and I have done puppetry, to the more philosophical aspects of puppetry, which I'm very interested in. So,
and that's what's bringing you to Prague, I take it, is.
Yeah, well, for years I've been working on this project called Gravity from Above. And back in 2005, I made a serious kind of commitment to studying puppetry. And also that's when I started doing it. And that was a few months trip going to puppet theaters in Europe.
Now, Byrne, how did you get into puppetry? Now, was there like a specific person or a specific show? Or
no,
what
it was really these
films.
That? I saw there's a Czech puppet filmmaker named Jan Schwankmeyer. And then there's the brothers Quay, who are actually Americans, but they've been living in England for a while. But their work is very influenced by Eastern European art, particularly Polish. And from them, I started originally because I'm also very much interested in the history of film, and I've been studying that for ages. But originally I thought, like, well, these are really interesting films. And I thought of them more like experimental films because they don't look like children's films whatsoever. But I said to myself, and then one day I remember saying to myself, maybe it's not the fact they're like animated films. Maybe it's the puppets. And when I had this moment, it was late 90s. It was actually before I left New York City, probably around 1995. I remember saying to myself, there's more here.
How long were you in New York City, if I could?
16 years. I grew up in California, but I was 16 years in New York City. 22 years in Alaska.
You were established there by the time you came into the puppet film and all of that.
Yeah. And I had a pretty interesting life there. Someone took some video of my farewell party in '96. And I look back at that and I go like, that kind of, what I was just saying about, here's something that this is definitely takes me back to that moment. And if anyone says you were running from New York, I go like, no, look at this. This doesn't look like anybody who's running. This looks like someone who had a very good life here and was able to, I spent most of my time, my reason for being in New York, which came after my time at L'Abri, and was a result of a decision I made while at L'Abri in Switzerland, was to study why music changed so much in the 20th century. B, how art and music.
You mean music itself, or how music changed the wider culture?
Both. Because the music did change. There was never anyone like, say, Jimi Hendrix or the Sex Pistols prior to that moment. There was no one, for instance, people often say like, yeah, punk rock, these guys are just screaming. It's like, yeah, people have been doing this forever. Really? Go find them and bring them to me, because I'd really like
They don't know the jam, man. If that's what they think.
No, well, part of it is that when people grow up, how old are you? Late 20s, early 30s?
I'm 37.
Okay, late 30s, second half of 30. You're well preserved. So, but here's the thing, is that people grow up in a time, and just as I did, when I was born in 1955, by the time I started thinking about anything, say when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, I just always assumed World War II had always just happened. It was only 5, 10 years earlier than I was born that it ended. But I just assumed, I always assumed we were
against the Russians. I always assume, it's just like you grow up in a world that, oh, these things have already happened. So it's the same with, certain musical styles. I just had a younger Georgian guy here yesterday, and we were talking about heavy metal and different genres. And he was saying like, oh, well, that doesn't strike me as particularly weird. I said, yeah, turn your head inside out and imagine it from the other side where this doesn't exist and suddenly you hear it.
Yeah.
Now think about it. Because that,
Byrne, if I could just like say one quick tangential aside, that thing you're talking about, how the tendency of people to view history as a static phenomenon is so relevant to the problematics in the Christian intellectual tradition, because there are so many people who see historical orthodoxy as some static product,
right?
That is like an impenetrable, inviolable dogma. But historical orthodoxy, the historical part, connotes progression through time.
Oh, exactly.
So it doesn't really work to appeal to it as the be all end all God delivered message or something.
We don't live in a culture, however, that values history or stories. I mean, we like stories. That's different.
Now, do you say we as an American, Byrne, or do you say we as Western people?
Yes.
Or what is the we?
Yes, the we. I would say it's the weakest in America, but what's happened in America has affected so much more beyond it that it's like kind of like as you go through Western Europe, it gets weaker here, but still, they have, the smartphones here, they've got shopping malls here. What they don't have here, no geeks.
No geeks.
No.
I know how you feel about the geeks, babe.
Yeah. But what's interesting to me is so that, I'm talking with this guy about, he's probably 21 years old, university student. I'm talking with him about heavy metal. He really likes it, but he doesn't live for it. It's like when people walked out of the recent Spider-Man movie, they walk out of it and they either say, that was a good film, or they say, I didn't like that particular.
So there's maybe Byrne, is it fair to say that there's an enthusiasm, but they fall short of an identification? Well,
here's the thing. When I first saw Star Wars, when it first came out, I lined up to see it, not on day one, but we'll say day 3 or something, in Santa Rosa, California.
And wasn't that, Byrne, wasn't that among the first films that had that phenomenon? Maybe like Jaws also? Jaws
was a little earlier, but basically, yeah. But here's the thing. When people walked out,
you were right there at the beginning of the geekdom, Byrne. You were like,
nobody sat there and said, I have to collect all the Star Wars toys. That mindset had not developed, which is why those original toys are worth so much today. It's because what people did is they got them for their kids, and you know what kids do to toys. They bash them and they played with them and they got them dirty and they didn't save the boxes.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because it was like the prototype of this mass commodification of franchises that you're describing in your cargo code.
Yeah, the 70s ends up being a very pivotal era. For instance, I'm because I do seriously collect books, records, movies. And
you can see the stacks.
Oh, that's nothing. What I'm trying to bring here from Alaska, my real library, eventually it's like this room and the next will be nothing but full walls, going up 11 feet.
You have to get a structural engineer to approve all your shelving.
I don't need to. I'm in a building that's like a bunker. It's a rush. I'm in the perfect building right now. It was built by the Soviets in 1956 before they started building the cheaper, taller, what they call Khrushchevkas, these really ugly tower blocks. So this one literally has walls that are like 1.5 feet thick everywhere.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So no.
You live in a bunker, Byrne. Yeah, there's just this like infamous library, I think, in Amsterdam, where they built this entire, beautiful, I don't know if it's neoclassical or what, but it's like this beautiful building, but they hadn't accounted for the weight of the books.
Oh yeah.
And when they added all the books, then the building actually settled like significantly.
Yeah.
It's like,
And for me, it's not the books that's really heavy. It's the vinyl, the records. Because I have
you must have a lot of vinyl then.
Yeah. I've probably got over 8,000 vinyl records. I've got all together with CDs, there's and singles, it's something like 13,000.
This is a weird question given, the repudiation of materialism and consumerism and commodifying content. But was it emotionally difficult for you to separate from that collection? And I don't mean as material hoard. But as the entry point into those ideas, was it difficult for you to not have that ubiquitous thing to dip into?
Fortunately, a lot is here. And one thing I've been doing is buying stuff to plug holes through Amazon and also on the street here while I'm here. I've also gotten very good at understanding Georgian art because I keep buying Georgian art books. But no, when I left, I realized full well, I'd done this once before in New York City and put things away for about 2 years in boxes. And then when I got them to Alaska, it was like Christmas. It was like, wow, do I actually have this stuff? That's amazing. But one thing I've learned over the years is this stuff is stuff. It's in the wrong hands, it's junk. What makes it valuable is a couple of things. And I've thought about this recently. I just got a book about a weird building in Portugal yesterday. It's called it's in the town of Sintra. It's called the Pena Palace. And, this doesn't relate to anything we're talking about. But what I do is I say, okay, what is this? Why I saw this briefly on a documentary and I said, there's got to be a book on this thing. Why is this such a fascinating building? And I realized, okay, this is built from a romantic philosophy. But then I realized this is kind of between the period of the heyday of Romanticism and the coming symbolist era. And then I see
it's almost like a material instantiation of a transitional period between vast ideological movements. And
well, what
all
it is
here in this building.
I see everything as having traces of either its history or the history of other things. And so for me, what's valuable, the first thing that's valuable is it's nice to get a copy of a very interesting book. I got a very fascinating book a couple days ago in the mail called Wildermann or Wild Man. And it's about the costumes that people wear in places like Austria, Germany, but all throughout Europe during certain kinds of street festivals. And they're very wild costumes. And so this book is nothing but photos of these things. And since I'm interested in puppetry, masks being a side thing, I immediately look at that. But I'm also saying, wow, there's a lot of just basically visual ideas here that I've never seen anywhere else. And that's rare for me to say. It's like, okay, this is making me go like, wow, this is fascinating stuff. So, but then, like I say, to get a really interesting book like that is one thing. But what really is interesting to me is to take the book and now put it on a shelf and knowing that it goes with a certain subject matter. So this goes with masks and puppets, but it also connects to very old paganism, but it also connects to Catholic Carnival, and it connects to Christmas pageants. And I start seeing it, for me, my mind is kind of like a
so Byrne, it's like the physical book becomes like that physical building.
Yeah.
That connects these movements in history, and you can actually see visually, physically, right in front of you, something of that constellation of connectedness.
Right. And then
really interesting.
The third thing, the most important thing, is if that stuff just all stays on the shelf and I don't read it, and I know collectors like this, people who just have to have first editions of Stephen King, and there's one guy in New York who just collected Western swing records. And my feeling is like, okay, but it's not really enough to collect stuff. You have to take it and then turn it back around and give it to people, what you've learned. And that's true with anything in life. It doesn't do any good for you to learn how to build cabinets if you're not going to make any. And if you're not going to help other people build cabinets, and if you're not going to pass on your knowledge. So
I think there's something that, and part of the reason maybe we didn't get into this at all, but I actually identify as what I call a cosmonomic existentialist.
What do you mean by that?
So I consider myself to be an existentialist, and the reason that I do that, in spite of Dooyeweerd, who's one of my primary intellectual antecedents, his strong admonition against ismic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of see part of the genius of his framework is that it's a radically critical approach that serves as a kind of antidote to the reductionist projects that result in all these endless isms of it. But the reason that I still, in spite of all that, and I believe in that incredibly passionately, but the reason I still, in spite of all that, choose to identify as an existentialist, not a kind of French or German atheistic existentialist, but a more Kierkegaardian Christian existentialist. Sure. Kierkegaardian is because I think that existentialism precludes rationalism. And I think rationalism is largely what is plaguing particularly religious philosophy, particularly in the Christian intellectual tradition today. So when I hear what you're describing about collectors who amass these things, or even knowledge, even knowledge, but never employ it.
No,
it's like this, the most perverse thing, because it is taking theory out of the realm of experience and glorifying it in and of itself for its own sake. But theory only makes sense as radically dependent upon everyday life experience. And it's nothing if not a reflection on that experience. So if you don't have the primacy of experience, the theory is literally worthless. And I think that's kind of what you're describing.
Yeah. And for me, it's very important to get the rubber to the road. And it's also very important. One of my worries about our present time is that people are spending so much time online, and maybe they're having great conversations. I don't doubt that there's some great stuff going on. But if it doesn't end up back in the real world, the world we all inhabit and walk around in, then something is missing. It's not the full meal. And so for me, the full meal is to have, I had this guy over at my house yesterday. Now, what was I showing him? What was I wasn't showing him anything. We were just listening. I could show him because I've saved. I have lots of these hard drives, external hard drives, and I put lots of stuff in there. I back up stuff all the time. And I have on my computers about 7,000 songs. So it's, someone could say, well, Byrne, you don't need your library. You have us. I'm going you don't know what you're even talking about. It's like, what's 7,000 songs compared to 13,000 albums? That's like 1,000 of them. And
never mind the fact that, an album that contextualizes an individual song is just infinitely different than the experience of endlessly having these atomized, decontextualized little units of music also flowing over you and into the ether.
What I've told people here is, I said, one of the interesting things about Georgia, and this is one of the reasons I want to get my stuff here, is that they missed the 20th century when it comes to all the big changes, because they were buried for most of it in the Soviet Union. And then when they came out here, most people don't realize this, but they had a civil war here at the same time that the Balkans were having a civil war. And most of us focused on that and didn't see what was going on here. So now they have total access to all this stuff online, but the culture got stripped of all this stuff during that transition process. So people don't have much context for things. So you can go online and you can say, I told him, okay, so you can go online and find thousands upon thousands, maybe 1 million heavy metal songs. So do you know which ones you need to listen to understand what? No, you don't. You're just, and he says, yeah, well, I listen to my friends. Well, I said, that's a good way. You start with one thing and you move on looking for the connections. But the truth is, a lot of people here, and I've seen this now, it's not just here, it's everywhere where the digital realm has superseded the material realm, that people, will pick and choose based on these, I have a video system here of downloads and streams that I can get a lot of stuff, particularly new stuff, downloaded. So that means I could just theoretically just sit and watch stuff all the time. But I am very careful about, I'm 66 years old. I don't figure I have, I get to 86, maybe. So maybe I have 20 years, maybe not. So
well, the Georgian bank, I understand, doesn't think that's going to happen.
yeah, exactly.
They have a much more pessimistic
You're dead
view
at
of your
70, but that's because Georgia for the Soviet Union was the place that made all of their cigarettes. And so everybody, so many people here smoke, and that really eats up your life. That and heavy drinking. Yeah. They don't do quite the kind of heavy drinking the Russians do because it's mostly wine here, but still, those things plus working hard jobs. It's like I was sitting with these two workers, and the one guy was said to me, "How old is?" They were asking through a friend of mine. He says, "How old is he?" And they said, and at that time it was 65. They said, "He's 65." And they said, "Oh," and these guys look older than I do, and they're like 55. But that's just what happens when a lot of different factors go into that. But for me, the most important thing I was getting to about, did I miss my library? The things that are the most important in there aren't the books, aren't the records. They're the journals that I've kept. And the photographs,
private journals,
and the photographs that I've kept, and I've got so much of that stuff. That's the only thing if someone says, okay, you can only bring like 1,000 pounds worth of stuff, what are you going to bring? That would be the first stuff. Just like quickly. If it was like,
that's really interesting. So that's kind of like, would you say that practice of journaling and memorializing your thoughts and experiences in writing, is the kind of germ behind that larger importance of memorializing that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I would say it comes from the fact that I know very little about my family history. And I've discovered some things that my mother never knew.
Because you were adopted by Mr. Power.
Well, he was married, my mother was still there. So she went through a couple of divorces by the time she married him, and then that didn't last very long, but my name did change. And, but I always felt the lack of having a father, but also the lack of having a history, So I became very aware at a very young age of the times I was in. Also, what happened was, because of Mr. Power, we ended up moving to the San Francisco Bay Area in California, just at the time when the hippie thing was going to take off. And so I have a very distinct memory of the world before the hippies and a world after the hippies. And in other words,
and more, and I don't know for sure, but more or less at the epicenter of that too.
Exactly.
Right? In San Francisco.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
And that's one of the things I realized. But not only that, I became involved with the Jesus People group, who ends up pretty much being the ground zero Jesus People group and being connected to the earliest members, people like Lonnie Frisbee and Ted Wise and these people who were there in like 66, 67. And were some of the first people, my own pastor, Kent Philpott, who does have an entry in Wikipedia, although they hate him because he was of his involvement with homosexuality, which was not the politically correct version of today at all. So, but the point was
that was, of course, in the time and place of Harvey Milk, right? So
earlier, yeah. So, but I think that having been, so I saw so much history. I mean, I've often said my life between the age of 15 and say 21 is Dickensian, with the elaborate cultural shifts I saw. I mean, and I could stretch it back and push it forward a little bit. And then even the year I spent at L'Abri, which was 78 through 79, it was just as Schaefer was diagnosed with lymphoma. But he came back from Minnesota, and he was, I did have a chance to meet him. Later, I spent more time talking to him on the seminar series of Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which they discovered his cancer while they were filming that. So, I knew like people like Schaefer and Edith Schaefer and Frankie Schaefer. And, I knew, I was like very much, I wouldn't say I knew Frank Schaefer much better, but still I was there, and not only that, I was there at what I considered, it's like I knew the heyday of L'Abri had passed, but it wasn't that long before I got there, maybe a couple of years before. And so I felt that the embers were still glowing. It's like the fire has gone down, but it's still very warm from what had happened. And so for me, that was an incredible period. That year I spent over there was an incredible period. It gave me the impetus to go to L'Abri. They were the first people from a Christian world. I mean, this is one of those things where you're born into a world already where these things have happened. But I was, in the Jesus movement as
well, and that's so true, Byrne, because I was literally born in Rochester, Minnesota,
right,
the same year and place when Francis Schaeffer died.
There you go.
So I was like, just picking it up. Like, I'm not saying I'm him incarnate or something, but yeah, I mean, it's like I'm literally there in the post Schaeffer world, so to speak, growing up in fundamentalism forever changed by his existence.
Yeah, well, him and Rookmacher and Os Guinness, and there were other people related to L'Abri, really through the 70s were speaking further into the Christian cultures, basically saying, what have we been doing? Now, what happened was part of this, and I tend to say that Frank Schaefer needed to make money, and so he had to convince his dad to keep making projects. And that got him more mixed up with the political right-wing stuff of the moral majority and things like that. Prior to that moment, however, Schaefer was not that kind of person, I don't think he ever became that person. And he eventually started to say, okay, I just can't do this anymore. This is, and there's a whole story with Frank and Francis Schaefer there. But the interesting thing to me was that I was at this moment where it was changing, and we were going from the 70s where conversation was still very open. I mean, I remember having public conversations with all sorts of people in my early 20s, later teens, stuff like that, about all sorts of things. And you didn't have to agree with anybody. That started to change. Abortion, certain aspects of feminism, and then AIDS changed that all radically by the time that was done. But here's what also changed. There ended up being more Christians who became interested in the arts. There are always Christians interested in theology, but more of them became interested in the hows and whys of how we got here. I don't know if you've ever spent any time, you probably have, with Ken Myers and the Mars Hill audio stuff.
Do you mean the new podcast, or?
Well, he put out these tapes. They eventually ended up as CDs, and it's nothing to do with the other things called Mars Hill.
Oh yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, what's interesting is he has just been interviewing for 20 or more years. It's probably 30 now, and it's still going. But he's just been interviewing all of these people who come from different Christian positions, sometimes not Christians, doing a lot of what Paul has been doing, but in a different sort of way. He came from an NPR background, and he's down in, I think, Charlottesville, Virginia, and but interviewing all of these people. But his whole thing is very much, I don't think you could have done that without Schaeffer. That is to say, to interview all of these people, to have someone come on and talk. I mean, he actually had the film critic David Thompson come on there and talk about Psycho, because he'd written a book about it. Now, Thompson is in no way a Christian, nor was he what he was saying. But Ken Myers thought this was interesting enough that let's talk. So, I mean, he's got a website with all of this stuff on it. But I thought what's interesting, you see, that already changed as a result of Schaeffer and Rookmacher. When I arrived in New York, I became attached to this thing called the New York Arts Group, that I've been thinking about them more recently, and I realized, gosh, all the people I knew, I had no idea who some of these people were. Now, but they were Christians who were artists from different fields. And I was there.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, like, were you an artist? Because I know you were part of this movement of kind of seminally part of this movement that produced a kind of musical collage mixtapes. Was that the kind of art you were doing, like music stuff, or not puppetry?
Well, no, I was at that time, early 80s, I was more giving lectures on art and culture.
It's kind of like art, intellectual history, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I had in the 70s already been making sound collages, and I continued doing that when I got to New York, and then I connected with people like Steinsky, who was very crucial as being the person who was kind of like the intermediary between the rappers like Grandmaster Flash, who were doing cutting on the live on turntables, and then later the people who would be sampling stuff. And he was the person in between that who showed people the way. And his stuff is very important. Most people haven't heard of him because his stuff was unavailable, because he sampled from everything. And you just don't get the copyrights for all that stuff. But
that's so interesting. A genre of music that I listen to a lot is called vaporwave. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
This is like one of those retro creations.
Well, it's like it's supposedly the mythos around it is that supposedly it's the first musical genre created entirely on the internet. And yet it's been this persistent, which I know that means you should hate it, but it's been this persistent phenomenon for like 10 years.
Well, someone told me one of my short collage videos was like vaporwave. And I just said, like, no, I've been doing this since the 90s.
Well, and that's kind of my point, is that, yeah, it's like completely derivative. And it's so fascinating to me because it's exactly, I mean, it clearly has its origins in what you're describing.
Well, also, I can tell you who was doing it before me. Like 1968, Mason Williams' Classical Gas appeared on the Smothers Brothers, but I can't remember the artist's name. It might have been Tony Cohen or somebody, but he put this whole like collage thing with the music, and that really struck as a kid watching that on television. But even before then,
that's kind of your thing. It seems like is contextualizing things.
And, absolutely. Well, it's because
and I was so struck, Byrne, by how you said that, because you didn't know where you came from, you had this kind of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it was like you were expressing this sentiment that you had this like need to contextualize the history around you.
Right.
Do you think that was
it's
contextualizing yourself, Byrne? Like, is that
double
part of
thing?
it?
One is I don't have much family history, so that's one thing. And the second thing is I suddenly realized I was in the middle of history, that things were literally changing day by day in the 60s.
Do you think you're unique in that realization, Byrne?
No.
And if so, no.
Oh, no. I think, but there were other people who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area during that time who might have been my age, who saw it. Although
I'm just wondering, like, what the relationship is in between the relative unrootedness or decontextualizing of your own origin and your desire and push to contextualize not just yourself, but the broader events happening around you.
Well, because one thing I realized, because one of the things that happened within the Jesus movement was over time, we started to become more cultish. And as we did, I realized that we became wrapped up more. We were with the hippies originally, in the sense culturally, not that we were doing drugs or having free love, but that our impetus was this kind of like wild and woolly Jesus people and such. We didn't have a specific church. We would go to different churches, but we would meet together. And I was young. I was always the person they would bring along to say, and this is Byrne. He never did drugs, so you don't have to do drugs to become a Christian. Because everyone else had come to San Francisco looking.
You were the counter example.
Exactly. But, and also, I was, not only did I watch as a young child everything changing, but then I became involved with this Jesus people group, and everybody I knew was older than me by a few years and was telling me these horror stories of what happened in San Francisco. You know, so that I immediately said, oh, I kind of suspected something like that, but I didn't.
Man, you know, that your experience in the Jesus movement resonates with me a lot, because part of my own unresolved origin story, which I think everybody kind of has to some extent, like unless your family is like super hardcore, close-knit nuclear family and so traditional that they, and even if they are, you know, an unbroken kind of line, they don't even often do a good job of recognizing themselves where they came from and imparting that knowledge on their children. But I myself came from a broken home, but part of that story was my parents met in a Jesus movement, incidentally, very arguably cult-like,
right,
latter perhaps part of the Jesus movement.
You know the name of the group?
Yeah, it's called the Way International. It was Victor Paul Werewolf.
Well, then you ought to know Sam. You know, Samuel, who shows up.
Yeah, I'm like sort of mildly acquainted with Sam Adams. I'd like to know him more, but it's one of those things where he's such a minor celebrity, Byrne, that, you know, it's very hard to get.
Yeah. Well, you know, I did an interview with him, but we didn't get into that. He was really fascinated about the Jesus movement, but he didn't. I noticed he didn't bring up the Way, because I would have told him more about how we perceive them at the time. But that's a whole different thing. But what happened was, as I realized we were becoming cultish, we were getting more involved with deliverance and demons. We were becoming, you know, who you married, what you did with your money, all of this kind of stuff. And there was a hierarchy.
I'll tell you what I think of as cultish from my like hyper-Protestant perspective about the Way International in particular is that, at least based on what I've been told by my parents, is that they viewed themselves as the one true church. And one, I mean, look at the name, you know, the Way.
Yeah.
And that to me is like big red flag from an ecclesiological perspective.
Yeah.
Especially as a Protestant.
So, but as our group changed, something happened. It's a long story. I go into it a bit in my autobiographical Q&A, but it's too much to go into right now. But the main takeaway is, for one thing, I started doing a lot of reading. And so I was reading the outer edge of C.S. Lewis. I wasn't, you know, I was beyond the Chronicles of Narnia and the 5 books.
What do you mean by the outer edge? Because Lewis is interesting because, you know, he's a fiction writer, he's a Christian apologist, and he's a literary critic. So what is the outer edge?
The point is, no one was reading his literary stuff then.
Okay, so that's the outer edge.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I'm sure there were people who were, you know, more serious theologians and scholars and critics who were reading that stuff. But among your rank and file Christians, no. It was just like you stuck with the fiction, and you stuck with the 5 books that Macmillan publishes.
And that tends to be the thing with Lewis. It's so interesting because, and I don't know if this is directly analogous to the fandom that you were alluding to before, but there is this weird phenomenon how people get really passionately into Lewis, and yet only in one of those almost as though hermetically sealed compartments, which is so strange.
Exactly. Whereas I went the whole way, but then I added Chesterton.
Because that's your thing, Byrne. You had to contextualize.
Oh,
Lewis
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then I added Chesterton and all the other Inklings I could find. People like Austin Farrar. No one reads Austin Farrar. You know, it was after hearing Rookmacher talk about Barfield that I realized, oh, that name. Yes, an Inkling. I got to track him down some more. But so, and Solzhenitsyn, nobody was reading Solzhenitsyn. You know, it's just like I did not have anyone to talk.
My dentist is reading Solzhenitsyn now, Byrne.
Wonderful.
I mean, the world has changed so much.
What happened was that I suddenly realized that we were being affected by, and I would put this with Labrie. When I discovered Schaeffer's ideas and such, that's when I suddenly put two and two together and said, we've been affected by our times. And we became a very good example of the me generation. And as Tom Wolfe called it. So I started realizing, and then going, and because I never had permission, I took it. I started reading, I started exploring beyond, but I was always reading stuff that anyone would look at and go, oh, Solzhenitsyn's a Christian. They go, oh, okay. And they just didn't know how to deal with it, because what was happening was I was making connections between the Soviet Union and where I was. You know, I was going like, control. All right. You know, I was starting to put these things together when I was around 22.
Do you think there's any kind of sense of foreshadowing, Byrne, of your attraction to Solzhenitsyn way back then, and now you're being in Georgia?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And the funny thing is I'm as close to Russia as you can get, next door. And I've got all the access to Russian culture. The funny thing here is I'll meet some young woman in her 20s. And this has happened to me like 5 or 6 times. And I'll say, who's your favorite filmmaker? And they'll go, Tarkovsky. And I'm just like, I love this country. I could meet 10,000 women in the universities in America and rarely find that, you know, because it's just, but here, like I said, they didn't make the break into the categorization of knowledge that one needs to become geeky. That is to say, and I find the geek is more playful with knowledge. They will be more, they will, you know, they'll play the games. It'll be funny. They'll have all these in jokes. Not that, you know, I can have in jokes on all sorts of stuff. You know, I remember even when I was in my early Jesus People days, we had like Bible jokes and such. You know, like who is the? I'll ask this one. Who's the shortest man in the Bible?
Is this not a rhetorical question?
No, this is a Bible joke. It's just like some people say it was Bildad the Shuhite, but it was really Peter because he slept on his watch. That's stupid geeky, you know, Bible geeks. So, you know, we didn't have that phrase then. And my first association with the word geek was the person who swallows snakes and bites the heads off chickens. And it's always been that. You know, it's like whenever I hear someone's a geek, I go like, really? What are you swallowing? You know, it's like, you're swallowing too much. Come back, regurgitate. Let's get back to normal. But no, that's what I love about being here is that, you know, it's like people are taking ideas seriously. You know, it's like they've been starved for it. And so, yeah, I'm talking about this, you know, 21-year-old guy who goes to university. He's an art student. And I'm talking to him about heavy metal. And we're talking about what it means. You know, why is it heavy? How did Jimi Hendrix come up with this sound? He really wanted to hear this theory that I have not put out in a public way yet about the connection between Jimi Hendrix's heaviness and classical music. And what bridged the two, you know. Eventually I have to do this before I die.
That's so interesting because my understanding, well, it's interesting that you mention or evoke Hendrix in connection with classical music, because of course, you know, I was really surprised when I was in Bible college, there was this dude who was like the most buttoned down, clean cut dude. Mm-hmm. And he was an organ major. Right. Of all things. So he was like majoring in organ music, like sacred organ music. And it was a 5-year, it was like a 5-year program. But his favorite band was Dream Theater. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know Dream Theater, but yeah, it's like this like really intense, like heavy metal thing. But part of that, of course, is because of those deep connections.
You step on those bass pedals and it goes through you. And that is.
It's interesting to me that you evoke Hendrix in relation to heavy metal and the classical connection, because my understanding is that Hendrix had like no music theory at all. he was like a completely intuitive place. So I'd be really interested to hear.
And what most people say is Hendrix was just a genius. And contextualization, I just said, yeah, no one comes up with anything by themselves. He got that from somewhere, and one day I figured it out.
Even contextualizing Jimi Hendrix.
Oh yeah, because when I first heard him, I remember where I was. I was with a friend. We were on the side.
You're supposed to defy all categories, Byrne. You're not supposed to do that. You're violating the cultural dogma by even attempting to do that.
I love doing that because one of the things that people don't understand, and I don't think you can begin to be yourself until you do, and that is that you are a product of your place and times. So all those ideas, like I have a book from the 1980s of all these young actors, like the Brat Pack and all these, Corey Haim and all these people, talking about their ideas. It's just interviews with them. And they all say the exact same thing. They all say, and yeah, I also want to do something to change the world, and I'm sitting there listening, and it's just like, religion though, it's like too dogmatic. It's like you could almost like switch the scripts around and it doesn't matter. I think there was like one person who was just like, okay, this guy's got something because he's actually speaking, saying something unique. The rest of these people.
What's so interesting to me about that, I wonder how you apply that principle, which I think is valid, that we're all a product of our time, to what I see as your genuinely critical effort to contextualize yourself. In other words, how do you personally, as Byrne, understand yourself in a way that does not reduce to total victim of circumstance?
Oh, I'm never a victim of circumstance.
Well, that's what I mean. And I know that, and I can tell that by talking to you, but I'm so interested in like how you reconcile that principle with your own sense of agency.
Yeah, well, I told you a bit about the Jesus People group becoming a bit cultish, right? Well, then what happens is I end up going to L'Abri, and through that, I get inspired to go work on my projects related to music and culture in New York City. There's the movie Mad Max came out while I was there. And in Mad Max, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but in Mad Max,
a long time ago, yeah.
Mad Max is on the outside of this compound that has oil, and there's all these like weird, motorcycle gang raiders on the outside. But he's seeing this compound from their perspective, which is to say, they're looking at it like meat. They're looking at it like plunder. And you're on the outside looking at it. Then what happens, there's a moment in the film where he gets down below, he walks through the gate, and he's with them, and then the camera goes up, and suddenly you see the panorama of all the bikers and gang members surrounding this encampment. And now you're looking at their perspective on what they're looking at. It's just like, oh my goodness, they're completely surrounded. So that's how I felt going to New York City, because in the Christian world, we were looking at all the cultural phenomena. The word demonic would show up quite a bit. I took it demonic to be the Christianese of like racist or homophobic or something. But now I ended up in the middle of the bowels of some of the most out there performance artists and rock musicians. If I tell stories about this stuff, which I haven't done much of on my channel, but it's just like, it's a strong drink of water, it's just like, whoa. Yeah. But now I'm looking at the way they were looking at Christians, and they're thinking the Christians are all out to get them and all this stuff. And I'm sitting there going, and it's that looking at it from both sides.
It's the insider outsider, Byrne. You're the consummate insider outsider.
Yeah, but I always had, once I got to New York, I had a rule about, I went to all sorts of places, but my rule was there was a fine line between observation and participation. Treating them as human beings was always just part of having a relationship with people. But there were many moments when I was asked to do something that I felt like, no, this is participation now. And so, someone said, Byrne, why don't you put on a dress and go on the stage and hang out with us? And I'm like, no.
You're like, well, normally I would, but
No, I wasn't that at all. It was just like, no. It's just like no explanation necessary. I'm not doing that. And
it's so interesting. So that's kind of like your own kind of Pauline dialogue of the meat sacrifice to idols.
yeah.
And so you that's how you navigated those problematics of cultivating the maturity of recognizing that there's no power inherently in this thing, and yet it can't be entered into glibly or thoughtlessly either.
Yeah, well, I took one band out as their road manager for part of a summer, and I tended to look at myself as the babysitter. So I wasn't so much as participating as I was, their guardian.
My uncle was the road manager for the Funkadelics. Can you believe that? I
believe that.
So I'm sure that was a really interesting experience.
Oh yeah, and quite freaky. So, but in New York, I realized, I sometimes these like really out there musicians and artists and such. I remember one guy said to me, a guy named Dean said, Byrne, you're the only person people don't talk about behind their back. And I said, that's nice. I mean, I thought maybe people would, but I'm glad they don't. That is to say, no one was saying, Byrne's full of shit or whatever. But also someone else said, Byrne, you're the only person who's like together amongst all of us. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because many of them knew I was a Christian. And one of the reasons I was hanging out there is because, I went for a while to the Grace Episcopal Church there, which was, their pastoral philosophy when it came to preaching was description, not prescription. Right. And I'm like, totally, what are you talking about? I mean, you got to get in there and get dirty with people, but also they were, I could tell by these days, I'm sure they're a fairly woke congregation. But here's the thing. So they were doing like soup kitchens and stuff.
Well, that would be like a big swing back to prescription then, wouldn't it, Byrne?
Wouldn't it? So they were doing like soup kitchens. But I said to myself, they're in the middle of the village. Every day there are people walking by them that have like, their ears pierced and they're wearing bull rings and they've got their hair dyed and they're getting tattoos and they're making music that is absolute chaos incarnate. And they're doing performances involving, their naked bodies, and they're putting paint all over themselves or dumping oil on themselves, and they have no meaning. They're searching for something. And yet you folks are ignoring them to, in a sense, stay above the people you're helping. Because these people, you throw them into your congregation, you've got some real problems, because they're not going to be polite. They're not going to be nice. They're going to be really challenging. So I spent quite a while amongst them as pretty much the only Christian that any of them ever would meet. It was like going to, and the way I look at it is like, people spend all this time. I don't know if you ever saw the book Peace Child. It was a very interesting missionary book that was going around for a few years. And it was about these people who went to New Guinea. And they were going to an uncontacted tribe, and no one knew the language. So the first thing they had to do when they get there, well, first they've got to make nice in whatever way they can, bring a few gifts. But the first thing they've got to do is learn the language. Otherwise,
is this a true account?
Oh, yeah. So they got.
I read like fictionalized accounts of things like Barbara Kingsolver's Poison in the Bible.
No, this is the real deal. So they learn the language, and that takes a couple of years. Then they realize they can't, you can't say to someone in, the Solomon Islands or New Guinea or something, you can't say something to them like, and now you should believe in Jesus. He will make you white as snow. Well, they don't know what snow is. So you have to say something like white as coconuts. But even then, it doesn't make any sense. They would tell them about Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. And this is like nothing. Meanwhile, they're having wars all the time, or these kind of ritual wars. There's a great film. I finally found it again. I saw it when I was a kid. I have a whole weird New Guinea connection here, that not from ever going there, but from seeing these films at different points in my life. But in Dead Birds, it's like one tribe, they fight each other, and sometimes they go in with a third tribe, but this whole revenge cycle. So they have to kill once they kill someone on the other side, the war's over. And then those people now have the debt, and they have to kill someone on the other side. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And so these people realize it's not enough to know the language. We have to know the mythology. We have to know what's motivating them. And so what was motivating them was revenge, but also this thing with the spirits and the elders and stuff. And so finally, one of the people who was a missionary is trying to figure out a way to make clear just anything, asked, so is there a way in which the wars end? And the guy says, yes, there is one way. The offended tribe, the one who last had someone die, has to give a child to the offensive tribe to be raised or killed or eaten or whatever. And then the missionary said,
there's a point of contact for you.
That's what God did for you. You see, and they understood war and they understood evil in a certain way, so that was the breakthrough. Now, that's what missionaries do, good missionaries. Here is what's happening in New York City. Nobody is spending the time to understand what is motivating the extremes of the culture. I mean, the people I was meeting were just simply inventing from scratch with rock music and the beats and the strange art movements and all this stuff, but just in the stew of it's like children pulling out things, going like, oh, this is cool, let's do this,
Yeah.
And so I felt my job, I was learning about the music and everything, but eventually it spread to all of the art and everything. And I said to myself, I have to learn this stuff because I need to understand. It ends up being exactly many of the issues we're facing today on a broader scale, because that is what was developing then. I mean, I knew people who we would now call trans. At that point, they were just transvestites, or people who were wearing the clothes of the opposite sex, or, it was just like all this stuff. But this was the world I was living in, and so I dug into the mythology. What's motivating these people?
Do you think there's any sense, Byrne, in which the Episcopalians that you encountered at that congregation at that time was still in denial from being the apex of American civic life as the mainline church in say the 50s? And they just didn't get the fucking memo?
Well, also, they were, there were people there who took very seriously, for instance, about when one should go to the light blue suit, in the summer. It's there were people who took very seriously about these kind of signs of wealth and status. And that's my reason for why they...
Well, that was back when the Presbyterians were an old school synagogue where you could pay for a certain pew.
Right.
Which is, of course, horrifying to people today.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, Tim Keller started before I left, a couple of years before I left. And I'd heard a few things about, hey, there's a Presbyterian church up here, but I didn't go to it. Had I gone, I might have really appreciated what he was doing and might have stayed in New York. But I'm glad I didn't. I think Alaska was a fine move on the board, because it was where are you going to go? Somewhere cool? Somewhere cold. Somewhere
so you left New
outside.
York. You left New York for Alaska.
Yeah, which
So
confused everyone.
What's that about? So you weren't fleeing New York. We know you weren't fleeing New York, unless maybe you're a masochist. You're a glutton for punishment.
No,
Byrne.
I thought Alaska was a great place. Where I lived wasn't all that much colder than New York. It had better summers. But, and people would say to me, New Yorkers would constantly say, whenever I told them I'm moving to Alaska next year, because it took me about a year to save my money and get everything up there. They would say, well, Byrne, it's just igloos and Eskimos and polar bears. And I go No, it's just the far north. You don't really understand.
You can see Russia from your house. You know?
Yeah, well, that was before then. But, but nevertheless, I felt like they didn't understand what I was doing, because part of my thought was also, okay, I'm here in New York. New York being the edge of like all this art and everything, but I could see it ending. I remember I left in 96, but in 93, I said, this is fading and it's going to fade. And it did fade, because eventually the thing that finally killed it off was the internet. You know, there's still weird people in New York, but then you got hipsters, and hipsters are like the commercial variant. You know, they do some weird things, but mostly they, you know, it's just kind of like, it's all surface level, very little.
Yeah, it's like the sanitized version of counterculture, maybe.
Exactly. It's the sanitized commercial version of counterculture, where what you wear is like, you know, there's a whole symbolism. It's like, oh, these girls are into knitting now, and this guy's getting a top.
Yeah, so now they've monetized the ability to conform to your non-conformity.
Exactly. Yeah. So I felt like, you know, in the spirit of the first shall be last and the last shall be first, I said, so if the whole culture turns around, let's go to the last place rather than the first place. So
you made the Julian move. You became the Hutterite / public intellectual.
No, I went to Alaska. There aren't many intellectuals.
I know. I'm just saying, you went to the place that was like literally furthest on the map, and yet still part of the thing.
Right.
But in order to be better connected. Fair?
Right. Well, one of the interesting things about Alaska, though, well, I did spend 10 years there working at the radio station, which was, I put my New York skills to use there. Then I spent another 12 years working with tourism, including taking people to see bears, like in the flesh. And that was a very fascinating experience. But also during that time is when I started doing puppetry. And that's when I started making trips to Europe to interview puppeteers, which is what my puppetry book is about. It's all these interviews I've done. And I discovered that the puppeteers knew very well, more than anyone I'd ever met in an art form, the difference between the material world and the digital. And they understood. And it's like, I would ask them questions like, so what's the point of doing puppetry in an age when you can just flip a switch and you get like, you know, Netflix? And they said, everything. You know, essentially it's like, you know, this occupies your mind. It gives you things to be obsessed about, but it doesn't give your imagination any room to move, because, you know, except, yeah, I can write fan fiction.
What?
Or
Byrne, is that because all the hard work is done for you?
Exactly.
You know, now you're just the totally passive automaton, almost like, you know, not to channel Grim Grizz or something, but gleefully receiving your programming. So
Right. So, yeah, whereas I'm much more, I mean, way back in New York, I had already come back when I first started listening to some of the tapes I was discovering by Rookmacher. Rookmacher really had a big influence on me. Through him, Doiver, but Rookmacher was the bigger influence. And then Schaefer's stuff also. I remember the first time Schaefer was...
I think that's true for Schaefer too, Byrne. Do you look like Schaefer on purpose?
No.
Or did that just happen to you?
This is more of a...
That's like how some people look like Santa Claus. You just kind of look like Schaefer.
Yeah, actually, his granddaughter said that to me a couple of years back. She says, Byrne, you look like my grandfather. And I said,
can only imagine what it's like when you go to L'Abri. They're like, oh my God, there he is.
No, because I'm also a very big guy, and my presence is very different than Francis Schaefer's. You know, he was kind of a scrawny, medium height guy, and I'm a little taller.
People like me only know him from pictures, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah, but no, I'm kind of a big guy. So some people tend to be, I can, if I'm not thinking about it too much, make people afraid of me. Because intimidate them a bit. Just because, especially if I'm around a certain kind of American who wants everyone to smile all the time, trying to get me to smile is at that moment is kind of like, people have sometimes walked up to me and said, you should smile more. Yeah, I smile fine. But I've always been tempted to say things like, my mother just died. Just to like, like totally like, get out of here. You have no idea what's going on in a person's head.
It's interesting you say that that's not in Georgia, though. That would be in America.
No,
right?
nobody here.
Because, I read a fascinating thing about a McDonald's that had opened, I think in Moscow or something.
Right.
And it was like have you seen this stuff? It was like the very first one.
Yeah.
It was the very first one. And because it was like this, little embassy of Americana and Americanism, right. Of course, they have the same corporate programming of the employees, the Russian employees there, that they get in America. And so they said, you got to smile, you got to really be friendly when you greet everybody. And that was just not the thing in Moscow at that time. And it became this phenomenon where people they felt so good being in the McDonald's that they would just go almost not even knowing why, just to be around this ethos of like positive thinking cult or whatever.
Well, there's a fascinating story along those lines. The French are also notoriously suspicious of American smiliness, but so I get along great with them.
It happens. Well. The French, my wife and I were on our honeymoon eating at a cafe, nice place, right across from Notre Dame.
Right.
And like she gets her salad and I'm like the protective new husband here. And she gets her salad and there's like this living creature, this grub, like right on the top of the thing. And I'm like, I'm gonna do something as in the kind of heroic vein and defend the honor of my wife. And so I, call the person over and draw their attention to this thing. And he's like, it happens. And he walks away. I'm like, well, that's France. That's France for you.
Yeah. No, there's a great story where this American girl was in Russia, and she evidently knew Russian perfectly. And so she knew that there was a job opening, and she went for the job. She knew from just looking at all the other people, she was the best qualified person there. She had typical American confidence, and then she didn't get the job. And so she went up afterwards and said, how come I didn't get the job? I know I was the most qualified. And they said, you're smiling too much.
You're too happy.
Yeah,
Makes people uncomfortable.
Well, here, actually, they're a bit more like Americans here in the sense that Georgians like to smile. However, they have no problem whatsoever walking down the street just like, men, women, whatever. It doesn't matter. They don't feel the necessity of smiling like we do. So they only do it when they really feel it, but they're really into honest feelings. So, and I'll hear people argue in public and, but also, they tend to say what they think, and you kind of know.
And this is so striking me because, it reminds me of the amazing comment you made on I think it was on the Q&A that Paul just did.
Right.
About the people behind the masks.
Oh, yeah.
The fear is that when they take off the mask, there'll be no face.
Yeah.
And it's all connected to me now. Like the appeal of George, and like the authenticity, the lack of pretense,
right?
The kind of prima facie intimacy that comes with that kind of sincerity, even if it's not even if it's hard to bear the suffering of the human experience. The fact that it's just out there in the open, there's something reassuring about even that.
Yeah. No, the last 2 years has been radically different here than it has been for so many countries. I mean, people have died, believe me, but Georgians have faced a lot worse in recent memory. During the Civil War, I mean, they spent good chunks of time without electricity during the aughts. This kind of like, okay, it's a lightweight pandemic. Okay, we'll live. People are some of our older family members are going to die. We're going to have to go to funeral services. We don't like that, but we'll live. And like one thing about Georgian women is they are probably the lowest maintenance women I've ever met. It's just like, it's kind of like you could probably, say you're going to die tomorrow.
Resourceful.
Yeah. Okay.
Self-sufficient. Yeah.
Well, yeah, they're just used to dealing with stuff that would, I think, knock over a lot of other people. And
That's so interesting. And that's not, and that, or what would you say is the relationship with that or lack thereof to feminism in general?
They like certain
In Georgia.
ideas. They're more like certain kinds of 70s feminists sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. Where it's just like, yeah, we should make more money and that sort of thing. Yeah, being beat by your husband certainly isn't a good thing, and these kinds of things happen. But when you start telling them what's going on in America with gender and all this stuff, they just look at you like, no, that's not really what's happening. Yeah, that is what's happening. The definition of what is a man, what is a woman is eroding, and especially through the universities, which is why when I meet someone here who goes to either the American university or the Free University, where I know they get more Western ideas, I will immediately try to see how far deep they go. I'll just say something to get that. And here's what I've discovered. The most leftist person here would still be considered a right-winger in America, because they would look at certain things and go like, no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean,
also
I think it's so fascinating. One of the big things I learned from this great book by let me get my prop here, by David Koizes.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm saying that right, which is sad because I literally just asked him at a conference how to pronounce his name. But Political Visions and Illusions. One wonderful book about political ideologies and worldviews and that sort of thing. But in that book, he makes this incredible observation that conservatism and progressivism, they don't imply or necessitate any content. They're just dispositions.
right.
And so there's something fundamentally perverse about conflating them with a specific position, because it just completely destroys a kind of differentiated view by which you could critically assess or approach or even really comprehend what is happening in a broader political situation. But to your point and the observation that you were making, I think that perhaps in that context where you are, there's such a continuity historically with just the civilization as it's manifested in that place, that of course is totally lacking by comparatively in somewhere like America, that there's a kind of latent conservative disposition that just sort of overlays everything. Again, that doesn't imply content, but there's a kind of conservatism that is much more deeply embedded just by necessity of having this long continuity of these people here doing these things.
Right. Well, interestingly enough, if you're in a country like France, which originated the concept of, say, deconstruction, they aren't really putting that into practice, because, they've still got their old buildings. They've still got their old ways of life. They still, some things are newer, but they're not doing what Americans do. You see, Americans have this thing of, when I look back at things from my childhood, they're all gone. They got, Americans aren't deconstructing. They're like completely erasing it and then building brand new things on top of it and then raise it again and build something new on top of it. And they do that with ideas and history as well. So that you find people now who, it's interesting to me I've got my finger in enough pies online to realize that, it's really fascinating for me to watch how people are talking about, say, horror films or fantasy films or these kinds of things online now. And I'm talking about people who really think about things. And it's amazing how many of them don't go beyond the year 2000 in their references. It's like there wasn't any film before that. There wasn't any horror films before that. Maybe a couple in the 1990s, but but this is what happens. Americans are, and I think in the Anglosphere in general, more, I think it's kind of like many things start in America and spread out, and then eventually get to Western Europe and such. But nevertheless, we have a very strong power of changing ideas through our soft power.
Yeah.
Everyone sees American movies all over the world. And what's funny is I remember in 2000, I was in Romania for the first time and the only time. And there was these Ukrainians that I knew who met me there. And they were, the husband says to me, this is the year 2000, he goes, "Do you like Britney Spears?" And I say, "No, that's for children. I don't listen to Britney Spears." And but you see, that's what America was to him, because that's what
kind of the lowest common denominator.
Well, it's just, this is what we're pumping out. It's just like now we pump out the MCU movies and we pump out Disney stuff. And
I wonder if you've noticed or observed or have any thoughts or feelings on the, I won't say shift or move in the center of gravity, but growing cultural influence, like kind of soft power that you were describing of China.
There's a little bit here, but I'm in a place that has almost no Chinese people. And in fact, I keep looking for Chinese food, and I keep finding, Georgian is really called, Georgia is called Sakartvelo, and Georgians are Kartuli, and they speak Kartulat. So I call the Georgian Chinese food here Cartonese, because it's really more, it's got all, it's just like tastes Chinesey, but it doesn't taste like any specific area. It doesn't taste like Szechuan or Cantonese.
Well, the reason I thought of that is because even the Leviathan of the American cultural machine is now increasingly catering and kind of contorting itself to appeal to the Chinese market just because it's so fucking huge.
Well, here's what China wants to do. They want to put a railway through here, high speed. They want it to go through.
Yeah, I've heard about that. Where is that going?
It's supposed to go on one of the Silk Road trails. And
okay, is that the one that will go through Alaska to North America?
No, that's something totally different. That would be a Russian.
Okay. But I know that they've talked about that too, and I'm like, take the train to China. That'd be so wild.
Right, but no, but the thing is, in order for them to do that, they're going to give lots of money to get influence. So,
right.
But that's probably a ways off. Although they are working on it, and they've been working on it in Turkey and working on it in Iran.
Right. Huge infrastructure initiatives in Africa for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So anyway, yeah. So for me, being here is one more way of kind of exploration in a way. I feel like I'm here because I'm supposed to be here, because somehow in God's wisdom, he said, you should be here. And sometimes I go like, how come? I figure I'll eventually know the full reason. But I've been so glad to be here during the pandemic season, because I'm among people who just don't worry about it. It's just like, it's kind of like life is full of darkness and disease and stuff. Okay, this is here, they have normal human emotions. They just don't, they don't like it, but they're not freaking out about it either. Whereas I think America and Canada, you really see this kind of freak out mode in different places because they've had it so good. They've been living in a bubble since World War II. And in that bubble, they were on top. And then, the Cold War ends, they're still on top. And it's only been in the last 10, 15 years that, our position has started to radically be reconsidered. And so Americans, we are, sometimes you look at what we're really fighting about, and you're sitting there going like, really? That's all you got? You're so worried about your identity that you have to worry about your pronouns. Now, what's funny is I live in a country where there are no pronouns. And you know what? Totally divided, male and female. It doesn't make a difference whatsoever. Yeah. So it's all about your, in a sense, what you have here is people who still have, not all of them, The younger generations, I think, are getting more of the problem. And it comes with the smartphone. The smartphone is I'm convinced, is one of the most devious devices ever made. It just hooks people up too much together.
Byrne, that's why I got this thing. It's like, I mean, it is a smartphone, but it's like a flip.
Right.
Which is important because I have to make the conscious choice to open this.
Well,
when I'm done, it's closed.
I walk around with a dumb phone.
It's not this perennial screen beckoning me into the abyss of the dystopian hellscape.
All my phone does is makes calls and receives SMS text messages. That's it. And I like that. Now, I might eventually feel, okay, I'll do this. I'll get one of these things. But in the meantime, if I can go along without it, I mean, I'm going to go traveling. We'll see how things have changed in the last 3 years. But the guy I'm renting a place from is saying like, well, don't you get WhatsApp? And I go like, no, I have a dumb phone, but you can find me. I have a laptop. I'll check it. I don't need all that stuff. You can contact with me. That way I can contact with you. I'll find some place that has Wi-Fi connection. I'll be fine. I don't like being tracked everywhere I go. And like today I went out, left the phone behind. It's just like, fine. Well, if I go hiking in the mountains, I'll probably leave the phone behind.
Well, that's so interesting, Byrne, because I was just thinking about, Edward Snowden's autobiography. It's called Permanent Record.
Right.
And you're talking about, I don't want to be tracked. And yet you yourself are memorializing for your own private use.
Oh, yeah.
All these things in your life through journaling. But it's so fascinating how it's like almost the same kind of thing, but the idea of the voyeurism or the other or the outsider, or even the authority having that access to that record is just enough to twist it into this disturbing dystopian thing.
Yeah. The difference is nobody reads my journal. Nobody, these days I use this little digital recorder I have, and I often do a lot of like just talking on that as an audio journal as well. But nobody listens to that but me. Nobody, so I have gone back and listened to whole years of stuff just to see, oh, okay, that's interesting. But the point is, at some point I'll be dead. If anyone thinks my life is worth combing through, hopefully the stuff will survive, and I will be, it's just like someone with a bit of wisdom, hopefully, will go through and say, oh, this is something that probably a book could be made out of, or whatever. In other words, it's not for the masses. And also, most of what is shared about a person's life online in, say, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, doesn't tell you much about them. And so I've made it a rule. I don't, for instance, on Facebook, no political stuff. I don't do it. Nor am I trying to do religious stuff. I don't do personal stuff. I did mention, for my friend's sake, when my mother died. That was it. I didn't go on and on about it. I don't, on the anniversary of her death, I do know people who post, oh, my mother died 5 years ago. I just saw a friend do that. I don't do that. Because to me, that stuff is all like, you're not going to get it. I'm not going to try to even begin to tell you about that stuff.
Because
any
the
more than
level of translation maybe that's required to authentically express that into an inherently shallow and commodified medium, it's just not worth it.
Right. Now, I do more through videos. But even then, it's managed according to my, it's just like someone asked me a question about, my relationship to women and stuff. And I was just like, yeah, no, you don't get that. It's like not the right place for it. It's like, why am I not married? Well, I can give you a couple of scenarios. We'll just say I was in the wrong places at the wrong times. That's one good scenario. Two, I grew up in a broken family and didn't realize a lot of stuff till I was older. There are things I can say that are simple, but as far as the actual blood and guts details, no, you're not getting that online. It's just that there's certain things, but then again, I often say to myself, when I look at this bizarrely large library I've accumulated, I suppose in lieu of a family, I say to myself, how much of this stuff can I even begin to share? I mean, when I look at what I've shared online at this point, I'm like, it's just like minuscule. But then again, that's how it should be. It's like, I mean, I could tell endless, just personal stories of things that have happened in my life, people I've met, situations I've been, performances I've seen. And every now and then I think of like, what are my top 10 moments in New York City? And I go, like, oh, wow, that was a day, this one. And every now and then
it's like your wealth of personal anecdotes is itself the picture of combinatorial explosion, Byrne.
Yeah.
There's just no way to cogently even begin to comprehend what is salient in this vast constellation of experience.
Yeah. Well, there was a girl that I got interested in back in Alaska. She came up from another place. I won't say any more about her than that. But I suppose at this moment in my life, I was trying to be humble or something. And so I didn't tell her at all. We had all these great conversations, but I didn't tell her at all about what would happen when she walked in to my house. And that ended up being a mistake, because as soon as she saw...
You mean what she would see, or the physical?
Yeah, physically. And because it's the library. And it's, you say, well, do you miss your library? Yeah, but what's up here? It's amazing. Well, how can I do all these videos? It's like, it's because it's already all there. That's just for reference, Yeah. So, and it's just like, oh, okay, I need this. I go looking for it on YouTube. There it is. I need this. Okay, let me get a copy of that book or whatever.
Because in your contextualizing work, which is the kind of theme that I've maybe myopically perhaps focused on, like in your contextualizing work, what is important and what makes that happen is the dexterity you have to navigate what is before you. It's not so much, again, like with the history we were talking about before, it's not the static content, it's your ability to do the dance.
Well, yeah.
As though on the toes, it's your ability to do that, keep on your toes, do the dance, and navigate what the stream that's coming to you. Right. And I think that's what's so compelling about your 3 channels on YouTube, and why you've attracted this kind of global microcosmic audience.
Yeah, well, the 3 channels also have 3 different kinds of audiences, and so it's, I mean, there are
you're like the C.S. Lewis. You've even got your tripartite division there.
Well,
do you find that your enthusiasts, Byrne, which is a weird way to put it, but if you'll just allow me for a second, do you find that your enthusiasts transcend those compartments, or do they tend to get locked in too, like the Lewis sites?
Oh no, my world is even much bigger than anyone has seen yet. There's a 4th site that nobody, 1 or 2 people know about, and it's the site for my creative output. And so what I'm doing is slowly adding things to it until the day I tell people about it. And it's been up there for 3 years.
I feel like I want to ask, but I feel like I shouldn't, because it seems it's not ready yet. It's still gestating. It feels like
it is what it is. But it's, I have to put the big pieces on. I've been putting small pieces, but there are really big pieces. And then there's a novel that I wrote that's when I tell people about it, and the more I tell them, and I've let people read it, and then they call me in the middle of the night going like, Byrne, what's going on with it? There was a woman who told me that, the thing about the woman coming to my house was that frightened her to see the size of my library, because
when you said that you didn't prepare her, did you have a sense that it would?
No, I thought.
Okay. Because I was wondering, why would?
Because there are many women in this world who would love to be stuck in a library like mine, She wasn't one of them. So, but interestingly enough, later I told her, and she eventually left Alaska. It didn't really work out, as you can see. So later, I told her, this is about 4 years later after she'd gotten married to someone else, 5 years later. I told her, yeah, I wrote this novel. And she says, oh, can I read it? And I said, it's a little intense. And she goes like,
this is like your Reginald Olsen book.
And so I sent her a copy, printed up the pages. And she was saying, I said, yeah, this will be printed someday. And she goes, Byrne, don't get your hopes up. I go like, no, I'm not getting my hopes up. I think this will be printed someday. I think I wrote it without thinking about the market at the moment. I was more in dialogue with, Joseph Conrad and Dostoevsky and, Tom Wolfe and all these other people. I wasn't really thinking about selling it. I was just thinking about writing it. So she starts reading it. She reads it and she's saying, Byrne, just don't get your hopes up. I'm going, yeah, I'm not getting my hopes up. Other people have read it. They think it's pretty good. She calls me about halfway through it and just is apologizing because like I had no idea. I said, yeah, well, that no idea is what I have shielded everyone from more or less so far. That is like, there's a whole, it's just like right now I feel like I'm giving only one part of my personality. So there's the other part.
It's so fascinating because it's almost as though, like I sense as you're relating this, that there's like a kind of natural inhibition against sharing this, just because there's so much else that you're doing. So it's just like the sheer quantity of things that are engaging you anyway, to take kind of the front burner, and then that gets pushed back. But then there's also a kind of a reluctance, it sounds like.
Well, there's 2 more websites, right?
No, I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, the writing sites.
I don't even know anything. Yeah, I only know you like on YouTube.
If you look carefully,
and then I was able to connect with you on Twitter of all places.
Yeah, well, I just joined there. I figure I'll only be there for a while. I'm trying to get interviews with people like Tom Holland and stuff for the channel. But my feeling is that if you go to the description of any of my videos, you will find the connections for the other the essays. I call them the essay sites. So there's one for
the plot thickens.
There's the Anadromous life, and then there's the Gravity from Above, which details my hunting down puppeteers and stuff, and my thoughts about puppetry. So yeah.
So the Byrne rabbit hole goes much deeper.
Like I said, it's like it goes into making of films. It goes into art. It goes into writing.
And I so want to talk, and this is probably something for offline.
Right.
I so want to talk to you about the potential of collaborating on a film, which I know is very presumptuous.
No, we can talk about that. But
I just put that in your brain so that before I forget.
So, but your main thoughts have been about what? Theology, philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this point in my life, I'm pretty much obsessed and dedicated to elaborating and elucidating and kind of trying to, you could like to put it glibly, unfuck the intractable intellectual problems within Christian thought.
Right.
If that's not too like ostentatious, but
no. We would probably both agree that the fundamentalist modernist split isn't really a fundamentalist modernist split in the sense that they define themselves, that they're both modernists.
Right. Yeah. There's it's like a family resemblances, maybe.
Well, in the sense, the whole idea of literalness that the fundamentalists hang on to dearly has nothing to do with the motivations or the writing of the people who originally wrote the Bible. That's not to say it wasn't historical, but it's also not to say that they were thinking of writing a history textbook when they were doing it. Yeah. They weren't, and and I've seen a lot of people get hung up here. For some reason, I never have. Even in my Jesus People days, we were always, it's not so much that we had a loose interpretation of scripture as much as we were originally, and it was really great, we had a lot of interpretations. So we could sit there and go like, okay, well, this is Wesley, and this is, Martin.
It was like an eclecticism because the Jesus movement had no theological locus of its own.
Exactly. I often say we were on the Wild West of Protestantism. It was just like out beyond what most people would.
It was almost like the manifestation of counterculture in the church, perhaps.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, it was. People sometimes use the phrase Jesus freak, which I don't like. We never used that phrase. It was derogatory. But freak meant hippies. It didn't mean freak as in sideshow freak.
Then, of course, Byrne, and to bring that into my era, even that became commodified with DC Talk.
Exactly.
I mean, the most bizarre, mimicry of grunge.
Exactly.
And I'm sure you could say a lot about that, but I couldn't resist. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. One of my biggest hangups, thinking about Christian music, I need to do my video on Christian music. I did a lecture. It was called From the Monastery to the Marketplace. And it was basically a history of a certain aspect of Christian music. I didn't get that deeply into liturgy as much as I talked about, the Christian songwriting and such, and how at a certain point it went into commercialism. And that point actually is about the 1870s. And then the Jesus movement kind of had a moment when it was trying to break free. And then it was all commodified again, but without going off into that, I think that my problem, and this I really got from Rookmacher, he said and also Jacques Ellul, he said, we're always imitating. And let me rephrase it. We're now imitating. We've been imitating since, say, the middle of the 1800s because we had so thrown aside our artistic, creative heritage that, someone like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien stand out for not imitating. They set the standards. And so Christian.
What's so interesting about that is both of them, I think, are not imitating, but they're doing novel, innovative things in light of an incredible grasp and awareness of the literary traditions or the mythological traditions. And so it's so interesting because it's not as though, this is some wild, far-flung science fiction. I don't mean literally science, but it's not as if they're just creating out of whole cloth these things. It's incredibly emergent out of a deep, continuous tradition, but it's not derivative.
Exactly. And that's how I've tried to kind of do everything. And it's a combination of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings mixed with what I learned at L'Abri, mixed with other people like Walker Percy or Solzhenitsyn or Dostoevsky. Tarkovsky, the filmmaker, is a tremendous influence on me, and a lot of other figures in Christian history and who have had creative output have really influenced me. And so, but not only that, I realized, well, I'm not, it's just I'm not just getting stuff from Christians. And no Christian was living in a vacuum. So when C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are creating their things, well, they're both influenced by both the Romantic and the Symbolist movement. And I've nailed that down so hard that it's okay, well, that's a Rock of Gibraltar there. And once you start seeing these connections, then for instance, that's why, I've spent enough time in the art world and the music world to know that there are people who sit there and say, and sometimes it seems oh, there's nothing new to do. And when I listen to the general run of the mill of pop music in the last 10 years or Christian music in the last 10 years, I say well, you're certainly proving that. It's just that you're wrong. And one of the things about diving into puppetry is, and I told this guy yesterday, this Georgian guy, I said, the reason I'm into puppetry is because, a lot of people think everything's been done. And by the time I was done studying puppetry, I just said Oh no, you haven't even, there are things nobody's ever even thought about yet. And I'm finding these things in puppetry. I'm finding them in the weird corners that people have left things in, art and music.
What's so interesting to me, Byrne, about your fascination with puppetry is that it seems to me that what you're describing in the stagnation of popular culture,
right,
is a failure of imagination.
Well, it's a failure of imagination because everyone's hooked up to the big machine.
Right. Because when it's a highly derivative, commodified, and all the stuff, and it's kind of like we were getting.
That's the whole hero's journey thing. Everyone's got this template.
We're totally synced up. Yeah. It's the regurgitation of the hero's journey, and as Paul, so poignantly puts it, it's bottoming out.
Yeah.
It's bottoming out through the endless recursion.
Well,
but what's so interesting to me about you,
Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey, and he's like, he uses all these biblical figures and goes like, yeah, there's Moses. And I go like, well, what did you stop halfway in the story?
Yeah,
it doesn't end up as the hero's journey. It's like David, did you stop before he ends up saying, I can't build the temple because I've committed too much violence? Did you go to Solomon? It's like, I've slept with too many women. The story of Jesus doesn't end particularly well because he gets crucified. I mean, that's not really the hero's journey, but yes, he gets resurrected. Only if you think that was purely mythology and not.
Yeah, I mean, failure of imagination isn't just subjective; it's also a failure to recognize the imaginatory. But I have this thesis, and I wonder what you think about it. It just occurred to me that your fascination with puppetry, and you're being drawn to that, is it strikes me as it's somehow related to the preservation of imagination. Like I've often felt like, as a Protestant and a kind of recuperating fundamentalist, you have this complicated relationship with prayer, which, like for Protestants, is often just simply conversational speech directed toward God. And there's something about engaging in that's radically dependent upon faith, because you can't address this thing that you don't believe exists.
Right.
And and as the author of Hebrews says, in order to please him, we must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Like he actually makes a point, whoever the fuck wrote the thing, actually makes the point of saying, you have to believe that God exists.
Right.
Which, would seem to be like the most non-binary, but analogously, so just like how prayer is radically dependent upon faith, and you can't even really do it at all if you don't have faith, unless it's like some sort of almost like mantra chanting thing, which is not really the Protestant kind of view of prayer, or even like the way Hannah prayed.
Right.
And so I wonder if there's an analogy there in puppetry that, you can't engage in puppetry apart from imagination.
Yes. Also, it is like many arts. I asked this famous puppet historian in Poland, I said, what makes puppetry different? What is puppetry? And he goes, essentially, it's like that the actor takes an inanimate object and breathes life into it, to which I said, exactly what I said, like God did with Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that is, it is.
It's such a pure expression of creation.
Well, also, I think the value of puppetry, here, I came to puppetry because I got to the end of music. That is to say, I saw the end of the rock story, the end of the 20th century. And I said to myself, and there's still my music book I need to write. I said to myself, I've got, we've arrived at a point where there was like a musical war going on. And in fact, the subtitle of the book that I just barely started writing, I wrote the introductory chapter, but it's called The Sound of War. And it's music, not music in history or music history, but music as history in the 20th century. But then you get to the end, and who wins the war? Well, the war is won by the commercial forces. I'd rather say that than capitalism, because that means nothing to me. But
like the clear channels and
it's won by the people who can figure out a way to sell this back to people. The people who can commodify it and turn it into what they have turned it into. So sometime I was already formulating this idea before I left New York, but certainly by 2005, it was really clear to me that what puppetry did that none of the other arts could do is its whole emphasis was on the material world. Although there is one form of puppetry, shadow puppets, which isn't. But even that, you have to have material to make them. And so what I saw was that this is the perfect antidote to the virtual world, the digital world. Not that you can't film.
It's so interesting because it's not, I mean, it is the material world, but it's not merely the material world,
No.
right? Because in other words, it's not like puppetry is some analog to physicalism or something.
No.
Because there is that imaginative, creative,
Exactly.
animating, breathing of life into it.
Right.
That elevates it into almost like not an analog for the physical as such, but an analog for unadulterated experience itself, perhaps.
Yeah, and also I think David Bowie was once interviewed, and he was asked about technology and music, and he said, I think the technology, all the internet and stuff that's coming, I think it's just an illusion. And he says what people really want to do is when they go home from their highly technological work of sitting in front of these keyboards and doing all this stuff, what they really want to do is touch wood. And that's what puppetry is. It is sometimes literally wood, but it's the physical thing. See, because this, doesn't give us the physical thing. We are separated. We are 10 time zones away from each other. If I suddenly were to die of a heart attack right now, there's nothing much you could do for me.
I wouldn't even know who to call.
Exactly. If I was to not make videos for a month because something had happened to me, who would know? I mean, eventually somebody would. But the point is, it's not a real community. Real community which is what I'm doing here. Because one of the reasons I like being in Georgia is because, this stuff is here, but people don't spend a lot of time talking on, visual forms to each other. They look to hang out with each other. They still meet at these ritual meals called supras, where people will sing together and sometimes do these dances and stuff. You can walk into a church here and hear music. I've had my mind royally blown quite a few times. Interestingly enough, they don't really let the congregation sing. They just have these really beautiful voices. But that's a whole different subject. But I think we're starved for the real. We are starved for real contact with people. We're starved for stuff.
I think you're absolutely right, Byrne, and I think it's so true that there's this weird irony in that here's you and I feel like even in the lack of immediacy here, like we've forged a real and genuine connection. But I think the reason for that is exactly what you're saying, because there's such a hunger and a longing for that authenticity and immediacy that takes place in that a la puppetry, unadulterated experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I've exclusively come to know of you and reach out to you and now connect, however impoverishedly, with you through this digital means, I hope to meet you in person.
Exactly.
I really do.
That's the key. So for instance, when I go back to Alaska, I hope to swing down and actually meet Paul Vanderklay, because it's like, I've had some good conversations with him. It's like, I want to take it out of the realm of the virtual and put it in the realm of the real. The next time I talk to him, we have that shared thing. So it's a good, the way I put it is, it's like the way I tell people about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a good place to begin a search for something. It's a terrible place to end. And it's the same with online dialogue. It's a good place to begin. A good place we can make these connections, but it's a terrible place to end. It's better than nothing. And I think some of the dialogues that we've been having speak well for possibilities in the future. But possibilities in the living world in the future.
Yeah.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, obviously, Francis Schaeffer had his ultimate end in Minnesota, and that's, God forbid, not the kind of end I'm talking about.
Right.
But I hope that, if you ever are in Minneapolis, man, there's a bed for you.
Well, I've been to Rochester before at the Labrie there, and I did the puppet shows there, 2 puppet shows. So you never know. But, we'll stay in touch, and I've appreciated talking with you. You got a lot of stuff. I'm glad to know that there are people who are enthusiastic and trying to reach deeper and to understand more. And I hope, whatever I have to give will be of help to you.
Oh, it already has immensely impacted me, Byrne. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, I was humbled, that you would even consider. I mean, I don't know if this is destined for your channel or not, but I was humbled that you would even consider being worthy of being part of the, deep project in authenticity. And I really resonated with your exploring reality video.
Yeah.
And just all of that. I'm humbled and honored to connect with you in this way.
Did you watch Rookmacher's What is Reality?
Yes, I love Rookmacher.
That's one of my deeper influences.
I have the 6 volumes.
Yeah.
And I'm so thankful for what you're doing to again preserve and promote Rookmacher.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, you're doing the most work.
Exactly.
I mean, aside from that publication of his collected writings,
well, actually,
you're doing the most in that space.
I need to get in touch with his daughter. This is the 100th anniversary of Rookmacher this year. So, but I know his daughter. I've visited her in Omen in the Netherlands, and that's how I could reach out to her. Because it's just like I know her. And that little germ I put in your mind, that's actually kind of related to what I would hope and pray, and maybe you would consider collaborate with me on, is something analogous to what you're doing with Rookmacher. Well, put it together and share it with me, and write me that kind of thing. If it goes on, write it as an email. I look at Twitter as more for the passing comments, but
it definitely doesn't lend itself to Twitter, that's for sure.
Yeah, but I've had a really good conversation, and in fact, this was pretty good I'd like to share this one if you don't mind. So I feel like it's. I don't think I said anything too stupid or damaging. So if you want to just put a pause in your recording now, and then we can talk a little bit on the flip side of that, and then you could just have this whole thing that had happened. Okay. Well, let's just say our farewells, and then we will keep going. So. Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for reaching out to me. I've appreciated talking to you, and we will get together virtually before too long again. But hopefully we will meet in reality someday.
I love it. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so that's the end.
All right, so. There you go, CW Weeks. Thank you, CW. I appreciated your spending time with us here on The Anadromist. And remember, Anadromist means swimming against the stream. And that's what you should do. And while you're swimming, don't forget to subscribe, do share these videos if you like them. Comment. Let me know if you like these dialogues that I'm doing every now and then. If you do, I might do a few more. So... let's see. Oh, yeah, you can contribute to the channel. Link below in PayPal. So do that and do swim against that stream.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.